Do you know the honorific chant, Namo Tasso? Do you know that one? All right, let me do it for us. When we do a Dhamma talk, we just repeat this short phrase, Namo Tasso Bhagavato Arahato Samsama Buddhassa. It just means we honor the fortunate one, the Arhat, the one who has entered Nibbana, and the ultimate Buddha. So, Namo Tasso Bhagavato Arahato Samsama Buddhassa. Namo Tasso Bhagavato Arahato Samsama Buddhassa. Namo Tasso Arahato Samsama Buddhassa. So, I think what we'll do is we'll go over tonight we'll be reviewing the Buddha's refutation and disputation of soul theory, which is very important to the times that he lived in, the Vedic times that he lived in. And we will go through, hopefully, these two kind of complex suttas, discourses. I think it's important that we give a little context as to how this very important teaching of soul theory and the refutation of soul theory comes into the whole milieu in which Siddhartha Gautama, later known as the Buddha, speaks to his culture, the Vedic culture. So the traditional dates that the life of Siddhartha Gautama is put at 563 to about 483, so he lives about 80 years. That's before the Common Era. And approximately 1,500 years prior to that, the Vedic culture was already very established in what is called the Indus River Valley. And there was, the scholars believe that there was an invasion of what is called the Aryan peoples who came from what would be now Northern Europe. And so you know that English is part of the Indo-European language group. Indo-European because there are a lot of Sanskrit words actually in English, and it is believed that these Northern Europeans, that is the Scandinavians, and combined with the Dutch and the what is now that is, and the Germans and the English, there was a wave that came over northern Iran into what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, and down into what is the Indus River Valley, where the word Hindu actually comes from the Hindu River. And already at that time was established a very sophisticated civilization with the four castes already very established, that is the Brahmins, the priests, the Kshetras, the nobility, the Vaishyas, which were the merchant class, and the Shudras, which were the workers or the peasants. And so this invasion shook up this already very well established culture and changed the social milieu therein, particularly in the religious areas. So at that time, the Vedic priests, the Brahmins, were reciting the three Vedas, the Rig Veda, the Sama Veda, the Atharva Vedas. And these are long incantations and spells and invocations of the various Vedic gods of that time for the purpose that we solicit gods today, or that humans have always solicited gods for health, for crops, etc., employment, means, every type of illness, etc. So in order to approach the gods, one had to pay large sums of money to these Vedic priests, and they would do these very elaborate rituals. Now, at that time, the gods that were The larger gods were Brahman, Pajapati, Soma, Varuna, Saka. These are gods that are unheard of today in the Hindu religion. Today, Hindus are either Vaishnavites or Shivites, right? They're either worshiping Krishna or Shiva. Those gods were, and those are, of course, incarnations of Vishnu. Vishnu was not around at that time, nor was Krishna, nor was Shiva, or any of their consorts. And so it's very interesting. If you speak to a modern Hindu, he will say, oh, well, those were old gods. You see, we don't believe in those gods anymore. And to me, it's very interesting. And Brahma, of course, was the creator. To me, it's interesting because you see gods come and go. You know, you see the Roman gods, the Greek gods, the Aztec gods, the Egyptian gods, and the Hindu gods have also come and gone. So at that time, the worship was to these particular gods, and Brahma is the god of gods, the creator, the all-knower, the all-pervasive one, the father of all gods. So now it is very difficult for most of the population to solicit the gods. It's not like today we could just go meditate, or if you want to go to a church or a synagogue, temple, that you would just pray, you know, directly to the Judeo-Christian God, which may be replaced by an alien God if we come back 1,000 years from now, you know. You had to pay a lot of money or do a lot of barter to solicit the gods, and most of the people could not do that. So there was a great dissatisfaction along with this breakup of the civilization because of this Aryan invasion, and phenomena started happening which was called the wanderers. So people started leaving the cities and the towns, and for the purpose of communing themselves with the gods, and not only for the various purposes that we normally solicit gods, but for also the attainment of supernatural powers, and also for the purification of the body-mind, so that one would not keep coming back into rebirth after rebirth after rebirth because of karmic impurities. And so these wanderers would start taking on various types of ascetic disciplines, very harsh self-mortifications and tortures of various kinds, which the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, also undertakes in his search for the gods, particularly Brahma. And approximately about 500 years before Siddhartha Gautama is born, the Upanishads are formulated by the priests as they try to co-opt the wanderers' new evolvement of religious approach. So the wanderers now start to approach Brahman in a yogic sense, that there can be a union between the individual and the God. That Brahman has the individualized form in the Atman, which is a form of the soul, a form of the self that is attached to the Brahman. And so they are undertaking these purification processes in order that they could reach a state of purity in order to create or to come to a yoga, a union that is, with Brahman. Now into this milieu is born Siddhartha Gautama in what is called the Sakyan Republic, which is estimated to be where Nepal and the Indian border now meet. And that's why you see the Buddha as represented with mongoloid features, that is, the inverted eyelids, etc. Because, as you know, the people of that region are racially that type. So he is born into a princely family, and you probably know the legends around this. He eventually leaves and goes into what is called the homeless life through his own fears and of death, of illness, of old age, and he joins these wanderers in trying to find the union between Brahma and the Atman. He is searching for the deathless state, or what is called the conditionless state, measureless state, the nibbana, the moksha, the liberation. And he, according to the legends or the traditions, that is, he spends about 6 years in his wanderings and in these very horrible ascetic practices, which we don't have to describe here, but they are described in the suttas themselves, that is, the discourses themselves. And eventually he does attain to what is called the enlightenment, or his own liberation. And in my first talk, when I've been here, I usually go into much more detail as to the whole biography of Siddhartha Gautama. But in the interest of really getting to this very important part of his teachings, I'm cutting it quite short. Just to note that the night of his enlightenment, that he goes through 3 periods which are called the 3 watches of the night. And in the first watch of the night, he sees his own past lifetimes, his own rebirths. And he says, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of rebirths I saw. My own, at such a time my name was such and such, and my clan was such and such, and I lived in such and such village, etc., or town. So he sees his own rebirths. And in the second watch of the night, he sees all rebirths of other people, the coming and going, the samsara, the wanderings of others, and he understands karma, and he understands paticca which we'll go into, conditionality, dependent origination. And in the third watch of the night, he says he destroys the 3 taints, and the 3 taints are kama, which is sensuality, bhavana, which is becoming, and avidya, which is ignorance. And these are the 3 asavas, as they're called. And at the end of that night, there is a refrain that he coins, and that is repeated by other arhats, that is, folk conquerors, who have attained to nibbana, and that is that birth has been destroyed, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done was done, there is no more beyond this, meaning that he has destroyed rebirth. There is no rebirth for one who attains nibbana, who becomes an arhat. Arhat means a foe conqueror or a victorious one. And who has he conquered? Who is he victorious over? Death itself. There is no more death, there is no more birth. There is no more samsara, wandering and rebirth after rebirth. Hundreds of thousands of rebirths and rebirths. So in this context, without going further into his life story, he teaches then for he's 35 at the age of that night of enlightenment, and then there's some period of time where he's wandering some more, and then he starts turning the wheel of Dharma, as it's called, in Varanasi, to the first 5 disciples of his, and then later there's 50 disciples, and then people start to understand who he is. No longer Siddhartha Gautama, but now he is the Tathagata. And maybe you've heard that expression. The Tathagata means one who has thus come, one who has come from that, meaning that measureless state, that deathless state, the birthless state, the absolute state, nibbana itself, nirvana as it's called And you're familiar that the language of the Buddha in the suttas, in the discourses, are in the Pali language, which is a kind of common, every man's version of Sanskrit. So, where in Sanskrit, your temple here is called Dharma. In Pali, it's Dhamma. And the word karma in Sanskrit, in Pali, is a kama. Okay? So it's kind of a slang, you would say, or a common man's Sanskrit, low Sanskrit, they would call it. So to continue more into the direction of the teachings themselves, and to give some context into the two suttas that we'll be covering tonight, you are familiar with the skandhas. The skandhas are the 5 aggregates which the Buddha said is what we consider the so-called self. Okay, skandhas just means aggregates or groupings. And the Buddha is very derisive about the so-called self. It's always called the so-called self, in fact. He says the self is as insubstantial as the bubbles in the foam of a wave at sea. That's how insubstantial this thing that we call the self is. It's a compounded entity. And the last words of the Buddha are, all compounded entities are subject to dissolution, strive arduously. So he's particularly talking about the self as a compounded entity, which is the 5 aggregates together, which I call me, myself, I, mine. We should go over that. The first aggregate, that is the first group, is the form group, or the material body itself, the kaya as it's called, made up of the 4 great elements, that is the earth element, water, fire, and air elements. So let me continue with the skandhas. And then the second group is called the feeling group of Vedana, or sensation group. Vedana means sensations or the feelings. So these are comprised of the external senses, and remember in Eastern philosophy there are 6 senses, not 5 senses. The mind is considered the 6th sense. So just as we make contact, the ear organ makes contact with sounds, the eye organ makes contact with visual forms, colors, all the aspects, etc. The tongue, the skin organ, the smell. The mind makes contact with thoughts. It's considered an external, in fact, sense organ. So you're taking external sensations, and then there are the internal sensations. If any of you are Vipassana meditators, you'll know that that's what Vipassana is really about, is about internal sensations and following those internal sensations. We've all had internal sensations. Hunger, thirst, cramps, aches, pains, spasms, Charlie horses, we've all had internal sensations, all right? And that's the second skandha, or the second aggregate, the Vedana group. And then there is the perception group, the sanas. And the sanas are the recognizing group. So, in other words, if I see someone of an Asian racial type, he's Chinese, you see, I've already labeled him. That's what he is. It's the perception, how we label things, how we see things. And so we Republican, Democrat, everything that we weigh and we give value to is the perception group. And we all do this, obviously, the fact-value dichotomy. We're all evaluating at all times. That's what's considered the sana group, the perception group, being able to objectify or recognize the consciousness group or aggregate. Now, we've heard this word consciousness quite a lot, haven't we? And so what does consciousness really mean? The Buddha, being the genius that he is, gives it a very narrow but a very easy to understand what is consciousness, but he relates it to, again, the six sense organs. So there's ear consciousness, eye consciousness, and mind consciousness, and taste consciousness, tactile consciousness, smell consciousness. So we could hear something, and then the perception group will label it and value it. You understand? Or we taste something, it's just taste, but there's evaluation, and oh, that's a hot chili that I just ate. You see, so that's part of who we are, and then probably the most subtle part of the so-called self is what is called the skandhas, or the formations, and these are really the downloads. What we come downloaded with. My mom and her mom, the DNA, the cultural downloads. In Jungian terms, a collective unconscious, everything that is causing the reactions. There's karma and there's sankharas, which are the reaction group. And through reacting, we create more karma. Karma is choice. Karma is rebirth. Okay? As long as you're on the wheel of action and reaction, it doesn't matter if it's what the Buddha calls wholesome or unwholesome. Even wholesome actions will put you into that rebirth cycles, numerous cycles. So now, it's important to understand in relationship, and this is a problem that Western theologians have with the Buddha and his teachings, is that there is no monotheistic God. There is no supreme being. He's not a monotheist. But what the Buddha is he is a polytheist, meaning that there are many gods, in fact. There's not just one God, a supreme God, but there are hierarchies of gods and different levels of celestial or heavenly planes, and one gets to these types of planes, God-like devas or devis, those planes, through what is called merit and accomplishment. Merit and accomplishment. So one could be creating good karma, let's say, and one could be a very powerful meditator, with very concentrative abilities, and through good actions and accomplishment, meaning knowing how to meditate really well, and moving into various types of powers through that meditation, one then could go into a formless body. That one could get out of, this density, and one could have what is called either a mental body or mind body or a formless body. He describes various types of bodies, and you'll hear that when we get into the suttas themselves. So those are the 5 aggregates, and we should remember that is what the Buddha tells us is the self, that compounded entity, me. It's important to review anicca. Anicca means impermanence. Okay, and so there are what is called the 3 laksanas, meaning the 3 characteristics or the 3 marks of existence. Anicca is one, impermanence. Anatta, no self, and suffering, which relates to the 4 noble truths. Those are the 3 laksanas. So anicca, meaning impermanence. Impermanence of what? Impermanence of the body. Impermanence of the material form. Impermanence of sensations, all sensations, external, internal, arising, passing away, arising, passing away, samudaya, vaya, arising, passing away. So when we did that talk a couple of months ago, the mindfulness talk on the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, we talked about arising and passing away. That is what really awareness is about, this understanding and constant awareness of arising, passing away, arising, passing away. So not just the body, but all sensations, pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant. There are three types as associated to all of the contacts that we make and those types of sensations. You're following? Yes? Okay. Perceptions arising, passing away. You see how our perceptions change. We thought Obama was a Democrat. You see? So, arising, passing away. Perceptions are changing all the time as well. Nothing is permanent. Everything impermanent. And the perception, cognition itself. The hearing, coming and going. Some things we hear, some things we don't hear. On the expiration of the physical form, consciousness, ear consciousness has ceased. Eye consciousness ceases. Arising, passing away of consciousness, and of course the sankharas, the programs themselves, always changing, always moving, not permanent. And so what is not permanent, can that be considered mine? If it were mine, couldn't I say that I can hold on to this, I can cling on to this, I can attach to this or grab this? So we're reviewing anicca, impermanence. We're reviewing the skandhas, the aggregate groups, and now we're reviewing paticcasamuppada, which is conditionality or dependent origination. Okay? And Thich Nhat Hanh, you know Thich Nhat Hanh, I'm sure. He has this interesting way where he explains dependent origination. He holds up a sheet of white paper, and he says, "Can you see the cloud in the white sheet of paper?" You know, in his nice way, the way he says it. Can you see the cloud in the sheet of paper? Well, so he explains how you see the cloud in the sheet of paper is that there is the paper is made out of the tree and the, what's it called when you mash together the pulp, thank you. And and that pulp comes from the splinters of the tree, and the tree comes from growing, and there's the soil and the sunlight and the water that feeds the tree, and of course there's the cloud that pours the rain on the tree. So you should be able to see the cloud in the sheet of paper. That's an example of dependent origination. One condition is based on another condition, which is based on another condition, another condition. So now in the Buddha's explanation of Paticcasamuppada, it runs backwards and it runs up and down. I'll run it from the top to the bottom for you, where he's contemplating, I want to conquer death. I want to get off the wheel of birth and rebirth, meaning death as well. So he says, what is death in fact? If I'm going to be a full conqueror, conquering death itself, and death shows up in the suttas numerous times as a character named Mara, just in the same way as the tempter or Shaitan, shows up in the New Testament to tempt Jesus. Mara keeps showing up in trying to get the Buddha back onto the wheel of birth. And so it's kind of interesting when you start studying the suttas themselves, because there's a lot of narrative as well as the philosophical aspects as well. So he is contemplating what is in fact death dependent on. Now we're going into dependent origination, conditionality. Well, in order for something to die, it has to be born. Something has to be born before it dies. So death is dependent on birth. What is birth dependent on? There's a condition of gestation, which he calls becoming, bhavana. Okay, but what is this period of becoming, this condition of becoming? What is that? That is dependent on clinging. Something has to cling to something in order for it to emerge Things don't just emerge spontaneously. Okay? So what is the clinging dependent on? The clinging is dependent on a desire. You have to, I want that red Porsche, you know. I'm clinging to that, mentally clinging to that, you know. And what is then the desire is based on what? Contact. I've got to see that red Porsche first. You know, I've got to make contact with the object of my desire. Okay, that's the contact. And what is contact dependent on? Contact is dependent on the sixth sense basis. In other words, you need to have an eye in order to make contact with a visual form. And what is the consciousness group? The eye consciousness, I love Mozart, you know, and I'm just going to get every Mozart record that was ever, etc. So it could be anything. This clinging, this attachment, this desire. It seems innocuous. What's wrong with Mozart? You know, I can see what's wrong with a red Porsche, but not Mozart. So, and what is that? The contact is dependent on the sixth sense basis. You have to have a way to apprehend that object or to make contact with it. And what is that dependent on? That is dependent on the nama rupa. You've heard people say namaste, namaskara? You've heard that? Nama. Nama is the essence or subtle part. Rupa, you've heard of rupees. Rupa is the material part of things. So we have the dense and we have the subtle. So it's kind of mind-body is what nama rupa translates into. There has to be a mind-body entity which has sense organs. Okay? And then what is that dependent on? That is dependent on consciousness. You can't just have a body with organs without consciousness there. And what is that dependent on? Okay, that is dependent on finally the sankharas. Okay, you have to have a program that this consciousness is operating from. You have to have an OS, an operating system, right? And that's the sankharas. And what are the sankharas dependent on? They are dependent on ignorance, avidya. So out of ignorance, reactions occur. Out of reactions, consciousness occurs. So you work your way back up to death. That's causality, conditionality, dependent origination. And now your question here should be, well, if everything is dependent on everything else, what is ignorance dependent on, right? Well, the Buddha, being the genius that he is, says that's dependent on the 5 hindrances. Okay, and that would be a lust or sensuality, anger, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry and doubt. And so your question should be, well, what's that dependent on? That's dependent on the 10 fetters. And so there's no end to conditionality. And so when you hear the Dalai Lama discussing, for instance, the Big Bang Theory, you know, with Stephen Hawkins, he'll say, well, you know, you have your theory, and we Buddhists, we have our theory. They're theories, right? Well, our theory is that nothing combusted spontaneously. There had to be a condition for this to happen, this Big Bang, right? And, you know, and they would say to Judeo-Christians, well, before God said, "What would let there be light?" What was God doing before then? There had to be. Was he having tea in the garden? He said, "Let there be light." So there has to be conditionality, and that is, of course, a very important part of the Buddha's teaching, a unique part of the Buddha's teaching, as well as the anicca that I'm telling you about, the skandhas. And the Four Noble Truths, I think you know enough about that. So we don't have to go into that, especially we don't have to go into it for tonight's talk. So that's by way of setting up. And now let's get started into the suttas themselves. I would like to start, if you can share, with the Brahmajala Sutta. And you notice I'm talking rather fast. That's because there's a lot to go through, so I'm hoping I can keep your attention to go through all of this. And you can share?
You know what? I don't have my glasses, so I can't see it anyway.
That's all right. I'm going to read part of it. Also, I wanted to I wanted to read part before we get into that in relationship to the skandhas. Okay, there is a sutta called the Anatta Laksana, which means the marks of the no self. Remember, I said there were the three marks of existence were anicca, impermanence, anatta, no self, and dukkha, meaning the suffering itself. Now, the Buddha says on the characteristic of no self, thus it was heard by me at one time the Blessed One was living in Deer Park, Isittama, near Varanasi. He addressed a group of 5 monks. He says, form, monks, is not self. The body, meaning the kaya, is not self. If form were self, then form would not lead to affliction. And it should obtain regarding form, that means it should be, regarding form, may my form be thus, may my form not be thus. So he's saying, if this body was my body, I should be able to say, well, this body, I want it never to get sick. You see, I don't want my body to get sick. If it was my body, I could do that. I own it. Shouldn't I be able to say, body, don't get sick? Or if I wanted to grow another inch, I would say, body, grow another inch. But he says, may my form be thus, may my form not be thus. And indeed, O monks, since form is not self, therefore form leads to affliction, and it does not obtain regarding form. He says, and you should not be saying, you cannot say, may my form be thus, may my form not be thus. And the same thing about feelings. Okay, now he goes through the 5 skandhas, okay? If my feelings were my own, I wouldn't get angry at my mom, right? If my feelings were my own, I wouldn't get upset at that parking lot attendant, etc. All right, but that is not so. We can't control the feelings. We don't own these feelings. Therefore, this will lead to, that's why we're in affliction, because we don't own these feelings. We don't own this consciousness. I really don't like to hear, a jet going over my ears, but I can't restrict my ear consciousness from that. And the same thing for perceptions, the way my prejudices let me see things or evaluate things, right, or judge things, and the same thing for my programs. Okay, if these were my programs, I would certainly delete a number of them that I don't think are good programs, really. Okay, so perception is not the self, mental formations, consciousness is not the self. Now, what do you think about this, monks? He says, is form permanent? Is the body permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, O Lord, the monks answer. Now, that which is impermanent, is it satisfactory or is it unsatisfactory? Well, we might say, well, satisfactory in the short term, right? But we prefer permanence. It's a little more orderly, right? For good stuff. So he says, now that which is impermanent, is it unsatisfactory or satisfactory? Unsatisfactory, O Lord. Now that which is impermanent, unsatisfactory, subject to change, is it proper to regard that as this is mine, this I am, this is myself? Indeed not, O Lord. And so he goes through, is feeling permanent? No, it is impermanent. That which is impermanent, is it satisfactory or not satisfactory? Unsatisfactory. So he goes through all the 5 skandhas. Therefore, O monks, whatever form, past or future, present, whatever, in other words, whatever body, past, future, or present, internal or external, coarse or fine, low or lofty, far or near, all that is form must be regarded with proper wisdom according to the reality. This is not mine. This I am not. This is not myself. Okay? So that's a little radical to say that. Or these feelings, wherever they are, in the past, in the future, in the present, internal, external, the consciousness, he goes through the 5 groups. He's saying, if you're regarding this with proper wisdom, how can you say this is yourself? They're impermanent, you have no control. All right, so again, he's being somewhat derisive about this idea of what is the self, because we have no control over this, and yet you say, well, this is what I am. Well, then why can't you avoid getting a cold? If this is your body, why can't you avoid getting a cold? If these are your feelings, why can't you avoid anger feelings? Or why can you not put them aside? So he's saying that cannot be the self. that you're claiming is you. All right? So I wanted to point that out with the skandhas. So let's go now to the Brahmajala Sutta, the supreme net. It is found in the Digha Nikaya, which is traditionally the long discourse. Is called the Digha. It means the long grouping. Okay? And it starts out rather interesting, this particular sutta. They're just... the monks are just walking down the road, and this is traditionally, when you read the suttas, there is no chronological order. It's just jumbled. It just begins anywhere. And actually, this is traditionally the first sutta that is read when you're studying the 84,000 suttas. Okay, 84,000 discourses that he gave over a period of 40 years. Thus have I heard, the Blessed One was once going along the high road between Rajagaha and Nalanda with a great company of brethren, about 500 brethren, and Supiya, the mendicant, too was walking along the high road with his disciple, the youth Brahmadatta. And now Supiya, the mendicant, was speaking in many ways in dispraise of the Buddha, in dispraise of the Dhamma, in dispraise of the Sangha. But young Brahmadatta, his pupil, gave utterance in many ways to praise of the Buddha, to praise of the Dhamma. So here's this group of monks, and there are, later there's an order of nuns as well, and they're walking down the road with the Buddha, and in the back somewhere this teacher and his pupil arguing the Buddha is not good, the Dhamma is not good, the Sangha is not good, and the pupils arguing back and forth. And eventually the other monks tell them, hey, Supiya and Brahmadatta are arguing about your virtues, whether you're good, whether your Dhamma is good, whether your Sangha is good. And what do you say, sir, venerable sir, Lord? And this is how the sutta begins, really. So when you see what I've copied for you, I've left out the first 27 verses where it is called the mere moralities. He's talking about how he's moral. And there's about, I've made it page 1, but it's really about 12 pages of discussing how he has attained to the highest moralities. And if you know that the Tipitakas, the 3 baskets as they're called, is what comprise the Buddhist canon. Okay, the Buddhist scriptures are divided into 3 parts. The first part is the suttas, the discourses. The second part is the Vinaya, which are the rules of the order. And the third part is the Abhidhamma, which are the higher teachings. Now, the Vinaya is the 250 rules of the order. And so in this first part, he's describing how he adheres to all of these moralities that are in the precepts themselves. And the first 5 precepts are the ones that all the lay people should know. Okay? And I don't know if you've reviewed this, but let me review it. The first one is abstain from killing, abstain from taking what is not given, abstain from sexual misconduct, abstain from false speech, harsh speech, divisive speech, or babble, abstain from intoxicants. And then when we do a Vipassana meditation retreat, a 10-day retreat, we're also adhering to abstain from eating after 12 noon, abstain from perfumes, ointments, unguents, abstain from high, lofty beds. That's a weird one, isn't it? High, lofty beds. Means comfy, cozy beds, Don't get too comfy. don't get self-indulgent, is what he's saying, you see. And so when you are speaking in dispraise of the Buddha, or when you're speaking in praise of the Buddha, you would start to review those 5. Does the Buddha abstain from killing? Does the Dhamma teach abstain from killing? His doctrine, his teaching. Does the Sangha abstain from killing? Does the Buddha abstain from taking what is not given? You understand? Does the Dhamma teach that? Does the Sangha abstain from sexual misconduct? Very interesting to us modern types. What the hell is, what is sexual misconduct anyway? In Buddhist terms, and remember, the Buddha is a genius. There hasn't been a genius like this in history, really. So there is no stone left unturned. Every question must be answered. And this is the difficult part for most people. It's not about God is love, love is God. This kind of simplistic generalities. Everything must be rigorously examined, scrutinized, and investigated. In other words, even those two terms, scrutinized and investigated, that when the Buddha is talking about faith, when we take refuge in the three gems, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, you're taking refuge. Well, you must give up doubt in order to be what is called a Sotapanna, a stream enterer. There are three parts of the qualifications, and the third one is giving up doubt. Now, so he's telling you have faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, but faith based on what? Blind faith? I'm just supposed to believe you? He says, no, scrutinize and investigate. Scrutinize and investigate what? The teacher. Does the teacher abstain from killing? Does the teacher abstain, and you go through it again. And this is what they're arguing about in the beginning of this particular sutta. And then the Buddha presents himself in great detail as to his own morality. Now, as far as the question of sexual misconduct, what does he mean by that? He defines sexual misconduct as having sex with any being who is under the guardianship of another. So, of course, in those days, the wife was under the guardianship of her husband and the in-laws, so you would not have adulterous relationships. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but the Buddha is a very radical person, and he talks about radical things. You will not have sex with an animal. There will be no bestiality because the animal is under the guardianship of the owner. There's a lot of repulsive stuff in the suttas, okay? You will not have sex with anyone underage because that person would be under the guardianship of the parents, okay? So everything is very specific. That's what we get into here. Now, he talks about the self, and this is what we're here to talk about here. So let me read a little bit about this here, and then I'll skip around kind of quickly. There are bhikkhus. Bhikkhus has come to mean monks. Bhikkhus really means beggars. In fact, the English word beggar comes from bhikkhus. Okay, beggars, bhikkhus. There are bhikkhus, other dhammas. That means other things, ideas, concepts. The word dhamma has a lot of meanings. The Sanskrit nouns are, especially conceptual nouns like doctrine. Dhamma can mean doctrine, ideas, thoughts, things, concepts. The nouns are made out of root verbs. So as you've seen it spelt in English, D-H-A-M-M-A, Dhamma. The D-H-A, da, means to hold. So the Dhamma is that which holds everything, basically. All right? I mean, in literal terms. So he says there are bhikkhus, some deep. There are dhammas that are difficult to see deep, difficult to understand, peaceful and sublime, beyond the sphere of reasoning. Now, we're here and we're going to use reason and language, okay? But what he's talking about is beyond reason. But yet we're going to have to use our tools, which are reason and language, here to discuss this. Subtle, comprehensible, only to the wise, which the Tathagata, having realized for himself with direct knowledge, not just theory, he's directly realized these things, propounds to others, and it is concerning these that those who would rightly praise the Tathagata in accordance with reality would speak. And what are these dhammas? What are these things? There are bhikkhus, there are monks, some recluses and some Brahmins who are speculators about the past, meaning rebirth, who hold settled views about the past, and who on 18 grounds assert various conceptual theorems referring to the past, and owing to what? With what reference to what do these honorable recluses and Brahmins frame their speculations? Now, it should be understood that this Sutta, the supreme net, consists of 62 arguments against soul, against the Atman. So he's refuting, disputing in 62 separate arguments. And they're detailed. So try to stay with me, okay? That's why I gave you that. So in the first case, there are some recluses or Brahmins by means of ardor, endeavor, application, diligence, and right reflection, who attains to such a degree of mental concentration that with his mind thus concentrated, he recollects numerous past lives. That is, he recollects 1 birth, 2, 3, 4, 10 birth, 30, 50, 100, 1,000, 100,000, many hundreds of thousands of births and rebirths. He recalls, then I had such a name, belonged to such a clan, had such an appearance, such was my food. So there are, he's saying, some monks or nuns, okay, who have that concentrative ability that they're able to recollect their past lifetimes. And he says this is the view called eternalism. And there are 4 views out of the 62 which are called eternalist views. He speaks thus: the self and the world are eternal. Barren, steadfast as a mountain peak, standing firm like a pillar. And those things, though these beings roam and wander through the rounds of existence, pass away and re-arise, yet the self and the world remain the same, just like eternity itself. What is the reason? He's saying, what is the reason that I know this? Because I, by means of ardor, endeavor, application, diligence, and right reflection, attain to such a degree of mental concentration that with my mind thus concentrated, I recollect many numerous past lives in their modes and their details. For this reason I know this: the self and the world are eternal. So you understand what I'm saying? This monk, having so much concentration, seeing so many births and rebirths, says the world is eternal. I've come hundreds and thousands of times. That's how I know that the world is eternal and that the self is eternal. This is the eternalist view. And then the second part is the monk who has gone through several eons of world contractions. He's not only seen his own births and rebirths, he's seen eons of world expansions and contractions. Therefore, with his power of concentration, he knows that the self is eternal and that the world is eternal. And then the third case is the monk who has seen hundreds of thousands of eons. Now, what is an eon?
A long time.
It's a long time, but that's not what the Buddha would say. The Buddha gives several examples of what is an eon, because remember, he's the Buddha. He's the genius. So imagine, if you will, monks, he'll say, that there is a mountain that is made out of iron, and it is 8 miles high, and it is 8 miles wide, and it is 8 miles deep. And once every 100 years, a man comes with a silk handkerchief, and he rubs that mountain with the silk handkerchief for a little while, and then he leaves, he comes back 100 years, he wipes it a little bit more. The amount of time that it would take that man with that silk handkerchief, reappearing, to grind down that mountain with that silk handkerchief would be 1 eon.
Yeah, it's pretty long.
That's a long time. That's 1 eon. So this second monk has seen tens of eons. This third monk has seen hundreds and thousands of world contraction, eons and eons of world expansions and contractions, as they're called. Therefore, he has, with his concentrative powers, sees that the self is eternal. I've come so many eons back, rebirth. Therefore, I know the self is eternal. So now the Buddha replies, it is on these 4 grounds, bhikkhus, that recluses and Brahmins who are eternalists, have the eternalist view, proclaim the self and the world to be eternal. And whatever recluses and Brahmins there may be who proclaim the self and the world to be eternal, all of them do so on these 4 grounds, and outside of these, they say, there are none. So this bhikkhus, the Tathagata, now he's speaking himself. Okay, the Buddha is speaking about himself. He calls himself the Tathagata. this bhikkhus, the Tathagata, understands, and he understands also that these standpoints, thus assumed and thus misapprehended, lead to such and such to such a future destination, to such a state in the world beyond. He understands as well what transcends this, yet even that understanding he does not misapprehend. He's saying, I know more than these guys, you see. And because he, meaning he, me, the Tathagata, is free from misapprehension, he has realized within himself the perfect state of grace, the perfect peace, having understood as they really are the origin and the passing away of feelings, their satisfaction, their unsatisfactoriness, and the escape from them. The Tathagata bhikkhus is emancipated through non-clinging. So he is saying that he understands that what these monks have seen and taken as the eternalist view are indeed feelings that they have. And feelings are based on conditionality. Feelings are not permanent. They cannot be called the self, basically. All right, so he's saying whatever they felt, that's just part of conditionality. So he says there are those dhammas, bhikkhus, that are deep, difficult to see, difficult to understand, peaceful and sublime, beyond the sphere of reasoning, subtle, comprehensible only to the wise, which the Tathagata, having himself realized, with direct knowledge, propounds to others, and it is concerning these that those who would rightly praise the Tathagata in accordance with reality would speak. So he's saying, if you want to talk about me in praise, don't just talk about me in morality, how moral I am, but my understanding of the self. Okay? And then there are what is called the partial eternalists, and these are views 5 through 8. And this is rather amusing. There's not too many amusing places in these suttas, but he says that at a certain point when there's a world contraction and expansion, that one being, because of the lapse of his merit and accomplishment, will there appears what is called the palace of Brahma, and then one being falls into that palace, and he looks around and he goes, I'm here in the palace of Brahma. Therefore, I must be Brahma. So he takes himself to be the supreme god Brahma. And he's there alone for eons, and he starts wishing to himself, oh, that there would be some other beings that come here. And just then, other beings who have fallen, remember I told you there are celestial beings that are in these other worlds. Like we last 80 years, these beings last 8,000, 80,000, 800,000, 8 million years, 800 million years, based on their merit and accomplishment. So what for us might be 1 year, might be for them 1 minute. What for us may be 1 minute, may be for them 1 year. You see what I'm saying? In that absolute sphere that a Buddha resides, the measurement of time ceases completely, as we know it, as we, through reason and language, have come to understand through Professor Einstein, time-space even. Okay? So, and the Buddha says, in numerous incarnations, I was Brahma. In numerous incarnations, I was Sakka, I was Pajapati, I was Varuna, I've been all of these. They're sort of honorific posts, like, Cardinal Ratzinger becomes Pope, whatever he is, Bennett, you see. You take on these honorific places because of that particular merit and accomplishment that you have had. And the Buddha has had the supreme accomplishments through, as you've studied the paramis, the 10 paramis, the perfecting of the perfections themselves. So why are these partial eternalists? Because the beings who have fallen into the palace of Brahma and say, well, here's Brahma. He's been here all this time. He's eternal. But I fell here, and then I was reborn, and through my ardor and concentration, I remember that I was reborn into the palace of Brahma. But so there's these semi-eternalists, but Brahma is eternal. this is what the Buddha says. These monks, through their concentrative powers, have come up with this view of the self, that there are eternal beings, eternal selves, that is, and partially eternal selves. All right? Speeding along here. If you're with us, we're going to page 7. Now there are doctrines of the finitude and infinitude of the world. These are views 9 through 12. There are bhikkhus, some recluses, and Brahmins who are what are called extensionists, who on 4 grounds proclaim the world and the self to be finite or infinite. And so again, through their concentrative powers, they have understood that the self is finite, and some have proclaimed that it is infinite, both finite and infinite, neither finite nor not infinite. Those are 4 separate views as we go from 9 through 11. And he also mentions that there is a type of a bhikkhu. He says there is a certain recluse or a Brahmin who is a rationalist, who is an investigator. He declares his own view, hammered out by reason and deduced from his investigation, following his own flight of thought. Thus, the world is neither finite nor infinite. So there are these different types of monks or nuns who are, through the powers of concentration, through the samadhis that they go through, the high, subtle samadhi levels, that determine through whatever feeling or mental abilities they have, that this is what the self is. It's finite or it's infinite or infinite, as we say it. And the Buddha says that's based on conditionality. If it's based on conditionality, it can't be permanent. If it's not permanent, it can't be the self. You following? It's subtle, all right? Now, as we go to page 8, the doctrine of endless equivocation, that is, actually in most texts this is defined as the doctrine of the eel wrigglers. Okay, the eel wrigglers are the ones who can't give you a definite answer. All right, so here in a bhikkhu, a certain recluse or Brahmin does not understand it as it really is, what is wholesome or what is unwholesome. He thinks, I do not understand as it really is what is a self that is wholesome or unwholesome. So if without understanding I were to declare something, a self, to be wholesome or unwholesome, my declaration might be false. If my declaration should be false, that would distress me, and that distress would be an obstacle for me. So these are the monks who don't really know, and won't give an answer one way or another. But they assert that there is a self, but they can't assert either way what it is, or they won't assert either way what it is. So these are, when asked any of the following questions, the eel wriggler will resort to the same evasive statements and to endless equivocation. Is there no self beyond? Is there both a self beyond and not beyond? Is there a self that is neither beyond nor not beyond, spontaneously reborn, etc.? So what we have to understand here is now that in India at that time, there are these large sanghas of monks and nuns wandering around the countryside, and they're all begging for alms. All right? And now, to get the alms of a king or a wealthy nobleman or a wealthy vasha, a wealthy merchant, he wants to hear your doctrine. He wants to hear your Dharma. Right? And then if he agrees or you persuade him of your Dharma, whether it's about, Atman, the self, or morality, or any of the issues of the day, then he will support you. He might build a monastery for you. He'll supply you with food. He'll supply you with robes. He'll supply you with medicines, etc. So there is, interestingly enough, and this is what's so interesting to read this suttas also, you learn about the social political milieu of that time, 2,600 years ago in India. Now, so the Buddha, here he comes, he's another teacher, he's another wanderer, and he's gaining a reputation. A fully enlightened arhat has appeared. A universal monarch has appeared. A Buddha, a Tathagata has appeared. The word is spreading, you see. Now, the kings want to meet this guy. They have questions, and the queens and the courtesans come, very wealthy courtesans come to ask him questions, students come, and of course the other leaders of other sects who have a few thousand monks following them as well, they come to dispute with the Buddha for alms. Okay? Because if you don't have the argument that the king, who's a very intelligent person, or the Vasa, who's the nobility, they're intelligent people, then they won't give you the food and the shelter, etc. So the Buddha has to be able to debate and win arguments. And it's not for economic purposes that he does it, but that's what's at stake. So these other, as they're called, Brahmins or recluses or samanas, which are ascetics, come to argue with him because he's getting more and more support. More and more kings are building monasteries for him and giving him the robes, etc., and providing everything. And the ones who, and leaving the other sects behind, saying, well, we're now supporting the Buddha, we're not supporting you any longer, see? So it is important, not just for economic purposes, the Buddha is very pure, of course, but other monks are coming to him, and then the king will say, well, such and such Vajragata has said this about the soul, about the Atman. What say you, Master Gautama, about the soul? And then the Buddha will present the Dhamma to that king. So why this is so arcane, I'm explaining to you, is because he's constantly being challenged about the Dhamma. And these are not stupid people, you see. They have concentrative powers as well. They have high samadhis as well. His teachers, Alarna Kalama and Udeka Ramaputta, very high levels, the Buddha's teachers, very high levels of samadhi and concentration that we discuss when we discuss the Eightfold Path to the cessation of suffering. The 8 samadhis themselves, or the 8 absorptions themselves. So these people are not people that are just making things up, but these are people who have attained to very high levels of concentration, and these are their feelings or their experiences, and that's what they're arguing. This is what I know because I have seen my own rebirths so many times. Therefore, I know the world is eternal, and I know the self is eternal. And the Buddha has to argue against that. That's why this is so arcane, is what I'm trying to explain to you. Speculations about the future, speculations about what's called percipient immortality. I won't go through everything, okay? But if you feel like reading it, you'll see how detailed this is, and for the purpose that he, being a genius of the genius category, has to be able, in the most rigorous intellectual way, to explain his own direct experience. He too has seen hundreds and thousands in eons of his own births and rebirths and others' births and rebirths. He too has seen that. But what is the difference is that the Buddha has understood that everything that he has seen and knows is based on conditionality. Arising, passing away, arising, passing away. And there is no clinging to any of these views. So as soon as the view comes up, self is eternal, Atman is eternal. I know this because I have come hundreds and thousands of eons. Therefore, I know that this self is eternal. No, he understands that's a perception. That's based on a conditionality, which is based on clinging, which is based on desire, which is based on gestation, which is based on paticca samuppada. You release. You understand the release, and the anicca, the coming, going, arising, passing away. So every aspect of the meditative process, and you hear people have experiences of great bliss, experiences of rapture, experience of peace, experience of unity. Fine, he describes that. You have great joy in this experience. Now you must drop that and go to equanimity without joy. Then you have to drop that state of absorption. You're following? These are the different samadhis that he's describing. If you stay there, you'll have this perception. And that perception is based on conditionality, the subtle stuff. Okay? Doctrines of what is called perceiving, and eventually even this aspect of perception has to be released. So when we're talking about the 8 samadhis, the 8 absorptions, the last one, let me review these if you don't know them, okay? The first absorption, you know there's an 8-fold path to the cessation of suffering, correct? That's the 4th noble truth. Suffering, origin of suffering, cessation of suffering, path to the cessation of suffering. Within that, there's 8, the 8-fold path. Right view, right aspiration, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right awareness or right mindfulness, and right samadhi, right concentration. Now with right concentration, that's broken down into another 8. You've got to get on this level if you want to understand it. You want to understand the Buddha? You got to get to his level. So within that, the 8th step, there's 8 more little categories. All right? And the first 4 are called the form absorptions. Now, you've heard the word jnana. It's spelled in English J-H-A-N-A-N. Jnana, with an A at the end. I'm sorry. Sometimes it looks like jhana, but it's pronounced jnana. And that becomes Chan, Chinese Buddhism. They can't say jnana, so they say Chan. And then that becomes Zen. Okay? So, but in dhyana, that means has come to mean knowledge, but what it really has meant is absorption. But as I told you, the root verb of the noun is where the action really is. So J-H-A in the word jhana really means to come close to. So if I really want to know you, I would come close to you. I would come so close that I would be absorbed into you is how I would really know you. So in order to know, and that's the essence of Buddhism, to know things as they are, yatta bhutta jana dasana, to know and see things as they are, not as we wish them to be, not as they could be, not as they should be. To know things as they are means to become completely absorbed in that thing. And that thing are those 8 levels of concentration. The first is what is called sustained and applied thoughts. We've all done this. We've gotten on one thought and just kept going on that one thought, right? That's called the first jhana. But you release that. As pleasurable, as interesting as that is, you understand arising, passing away, you release that. You're not clinging to anything. And then you move into the second jhana, which is the concentration jhana, where you're just in a state of concentration. The mind is stilled, and it's just being held. But that can be pleasurable too. So you have to release that. Instead of going, whoa, my mind is so still. Whoa, I'm so concentrated. You know, you kind of have to release that as well. And then you go into the third jhana, which is equanimity with joy. And this is the experience I was mentioning. You hear people who've gone into great bliss experiences, what Ajashanti, if you know him in San Francisco, calls compelling experience. So, but then you release that, you release the joy part, and you come into equanimity. Then you release that, and you go into what is called the 4 formless samadhis. And the first is the base of infinity of space. Base of infinity of space. There is no longer measurement as we know measurement. There's no more time measurement. There's no more distance, space measurement. If you want to go touch the moon, you just go touch the moon. There's nothing between you and the moon. There's no space. There's no time between you and anything. It's called the base of infinity of space. But of course, as interesting and the supernormal powers that you get, paranormal powers that you get out of attaining to that state of samadhi, you release that. You have to let go. Arising, passing away. You don't want to get stuck. You'll get into some heavenly body. You'll get into some state of celestial plane based on your merit and accomplishment, but you will fall back, okay, to where you left off, the clinging or the attachment, and you will get back on the wheel of dependent origination. You release that. You go to the base of infinity of consciousness. That means I know everything there is to know. I know what's in your head. I know anything I can absorb into, I know. Okay? Just consciousness, infinity of consciousness. But you release that. You have to let go of that. And then you go to the next level, which is the infinity, the base of no thing, shunyata, the void itself. The understanding that there is no solidity in anything. What the subatomic particle physicists have told us now. The Buddha was the first subatomic physicist. He already knew it. Okay? He already knew. The word atom is a Greek word. The Greek word atom means indivisible. They thought they had found a basic unit of materiality. Okay, but now we know the atom is comprised of certain parts. There's certain forces that are holding it together, and there's certain other little parts that are, comprising those larger parts. So he already understood there is no substantial thing. No thing. So the example I use is you could take a chair. We all can agree this is a chair. And then you smash up that chair and it becomes just some fiber with some polymers and different chemical parts. But it's no longer what we call a chair. There is a no thing, and then those polymers, of course, are just the atoms and divide those atoms up as well. And in that regard, maybe you've heard the Dalai Lama speak about the two truths, what's called the Loka and the Lokatura, and that is the mundane truth, the reality truth. This is what appears to be a self. Ultimately, there is no thing. Self. There is no solidity. There's no little man up here, who's directing the show up on the bridge. So that you're at the base of no thing. You're understanding shunyata, the void. But of course, you must release that, as subtle as that is, that state of absorption, and then you come to the state of neither perception nor yet non-perception. So I'll repeat that: the state of neither perception nor yet non-perception. So you have come to a very subtle place where, let's say, Etan, the perceiver, is barely perceiving the object. There is barely a perceiver and there's barely an object to be perceived. A very subtle state. And perhaps the last outpost of the so-called self, the compounded self, very subtle, no more body. It's called the formless state, whatever entity that is. I've not experienced it. And then you release that, no clinging to that, and you enter into the nibbanic state, the measureless state, the deathless state, the state of no return, the state of no rebirth, no death. So there's one anecdote. I don't mean to get too far off of this. I don't know what time it is, but we'll see how far we get with the suttas of the Buddha and the monks go to find a monk who has died on one of the mountainside retreats, and they are looking for this monk, for his body, that is, and they cannot find his body anywhere. And eventually the Buddha says, well, look up there in the sky. You see up there? And they look up and there's this little black wisp of smoke up in the sky. And he says, that's Mara. Mara is death. That's Mara. Mara is also looking for his body. But there's nothing left of this person. There's no consciousness. There's no perception. There's no sankharas. There's no materiality. And there's no feelings left. This person has disappeared somehow into the state where there is no birth, into the state where there is no more death, where there is no thing, ultimately. So it gets pretty subtle, and it's obviously hard to explain. It'd be nice to experience, I guess, or maybe not. But we could try. We could sit and meditate for a few years. So then there's, just to finish this, views 43 to 50, doctrines of neither percipient nor non-percipient immortality. That is, where one is perceives the self or does not perceive the self. A very subtle state. And then there is the state of annihilationists. These are the people who believe that there are, that when you die, that's it. There is no self left. The material body is gone. There's no rebirth. There's no nothing. These are the annihilationists, and because of their particular ways of relating to conditionality, they have come to this conclusion that once the death occurs, that there is no Atman, there is no soul, there is no self, there is just annihilation. Okay, and we'll go through that real quickly. You can read these all of yourself, of course. And then there is the doctrine of here and now, the view that there is a self here and now. And that is based on, in fact, these jhanas that I've described, because there has to be an experiencer of these jhanas. And the Buddha says, no, that's not the self either. All right, without getting into too much further detail, because I would like to eventually get to the second one if we have a chance. And then he says the rounds of conditions and emancipation from rebirth. He talks about that. Now, he does not actually say, besides the fact that there is suffering in any of these beliefs, because anything that is based on impermanence or conditionality is subject to suffering itself. But Buddhaghosa, who is the greatest commentator from the 1st century of the Common Era, says that one of the reasons, aside from the fact that all of these views, these 62 views of soul theory, lead to suffering, is because they will eventually lead to immorality, which again puts one on the path of birth and rebirth. So if you believe, for instance, he says, that the soul or the Atman is eternal, well, then you can do anything you want, because you're going to come back over and over again, and maybe you'll fix it later. Maybe you won't. Maybe you'll just party, forever, eternally. There's no rush, in fact. So he disputes that whole theory of eternalism. This is Buddhaghosa, not the Buddha is saying it's suffering, because every time you come back, you're subject to birth, death, old age, illness, lamentation, grief, all of the description of what is suffering, not being with with loved ones, being with ones that one does not love, not getting what one wants, getting what one does not want, attachment to the self itself. All of this clinging is suffering itself. So Buddhaghosa says, well, the other reason is because for the eternalists, there is no incentive to be moral. If you want to kill, you'll kill, because you'll come back again, and you'll have another chance either to get off the wheel or just to do whatever you want again. And the same for the annihilationists. If you believe there's nothing, that there is no Atman, then you will, again, you can do what you want. If you want to kill, if you want to steal, if you want to lie, you can do what you want, because at the end, nothing happens to you. There's no karmic rebirth in any plane, either earth plane or heavenly plane or demonic planes. And there is another view that's in here that we just skip by, I'm sorry, but it's called the fortuitous originists. And these are the people that believe the self is just created by chance, just random. Things just happen. There's no karma. There's no cause and effect. There's no conditionality. And again, Buddhaghosa rejects that. The Buddha rejects it based on suffering. Buddhaghosa rejects it on the fact that, again, if you just think anything is random, then you don't have to be a moral person. You can just do anything, because anything will happen. There won't be that order of fruits of karma, as it's called. All right? So then, just to finish this, he says at the end again, all of these views, these 62 views on the soul are conditioned by contact, by the mind or by the feelings that this, because I have felt this, because I know this mentally, I have grasped this, therefore it is. But if it's based on conditionality, based on contact, any of those 12, then it cannot be permanent. It cannot be the absolute itself, okay? So, and now at the end, Ananda, who is his, and then he says, when a monk understands things as they really are, the arising and the passing away of all things, their attraction and their peril, the deliverance from them, he knows that which goes beyond views. So again, it's about the training itself, which is what he says in the beginning. If you want to know really about the self, one trains oneself in awareness to understand the arising and passing away, arising and passing away. And once one understands that, one understands that there is no such thing as the self, which he has refuted in 62 very arcane arguments that are presented against him. And he says that, and then the Venerable Ananda, who is his assistant for his last 25 years of his life, says, it is marvelous, Lord, it is wonderful. What is the name of this exposition of this Dharma? Ananda, you may remember this exposition of the Dharma as the all-net of advantage, the all-net of Dhamma, the supreme net, the all-net of views, or as the incomparable victory in battle. So this is the 62 arguments on soul refutation. And if you think you have an argument that hasn't been covered in here, I guess we could, send an email to the Buddha or something. But this covers a lot, of arguments for... now, of course, we all want to maintain a self. This is just, we want to be immortal. As an artist or a father or a mother, we want to feel that we were here, and we want to hold on to this self, thinking that this is something good, or I need to assert myself, etc., in one way or another. And it is difficult to understand where in the West, for instance, soul theory comes in. Because if you've read your Old Testament and you've read your New Testament, you'll see there is nothing about the soul. There's no mention in Hebrew, in Aramaic, or in the Latin about soul. And Jesus did not talk about the soul either. Okay, so these are all later in the Judeo-Christian, I'm talking, and the Muslim, of course. I'm talking about in the Western religion, this whole idea of soul comes in much later, and the supposition is that it really has come from the Hindus themselves, from this idea of Atman, which has crept into mystical states based on these different samadhis, etc. But the Buddha... And I remember seeing when the Dalai Lama went to the last Kumbh Mela, this big event that happens at the tributaries of the Yamuna River, the Varuna River, and the Ganges, and this huge 10 million Hindus show up there. And he was there, and he was saying, from my brethren, we are all brethren. It's true that you believe in the soul, and we do not believe in the soul, but we are all brethren, And most people don't understand there is a big difference between the Hindu way of looking at this issue, the Atman, and the the teachings of the Buddha, that there is no thing. And this is anathema, this is a curse. And the Vatican has issued, invectives against Buddhism, because how can you say there's no supreme God, number one, there's no monotheism, okay, and there's no soul. Now this is, what kind of teaching is this anyway? It's so contra to what we, Judeo-Christian, grow up with. But once you make this kind of rigorous examination, which you must do, we're not challenged like the Buddha is challenged, for his food for the 1,500 monks that are with him. Okay, so he's not challenged, that we're not going to be challenged this way, so we don't have to maintain that kind of intellectual rigor, but they do. Okay, and this is unfortunately something that's missing in our country today, is religious debate. We could shoot at each other, but we can't debate religiously. But it is a tradition in Tibetan Buddhism. Debate is a tradition. The slapping and the yelling at one. You've seen that. If you go to YouTube, you'll see tapes of put in Tibetan Buddhist disputes or something. They yell at each other and they slap their hands and they're very fierce about it. But we cannot, and that demands rigor. And it's an exercise that is traditional that they should be able to debate. Because we have what is called parapati and parayati in Buddhism. Parayati is the theory or the study. Parapati is the practice itself. So one has to have both. You can't have one or the other. You can meditate for 20 years, and if you don't know what you're doing, that's useless too. Or you can intellectualize for 20 years and not meditate, and that's useless as well. But you have to know what the two things are, the technique of the meditation and the theory behind the technique of the meditation as well. I don't know, do we have time? Shall we try it, or do you want to read it at home? I think we'll read it at home. How's that? Okay, this is pretty.
Next time.
Yeah, maybe we'll come back for this one. If you want, whoever wants to grab these. I don't know if I've made enough of them, but this is another way that the Potthapada Sutta. I'll just tell you briefly. I won't read it. But what this is the Buddha goes out for his alms rounds in the morning very early, and he realizes that he's gone out too early. He begs every day as well. He goes into the village or into the town. Just because he's the Buddha, he's not going to stop begging. And he realizes that he's out too early. He doesn't want to wake the neighbors, So he goes to this park where this other sect is, and they're awake, and they're arguing, and they're talking, and they're very boisterous kind of sect, as opposed to the followers of the Buddha, who are shaved head and are very quiet and move and glide around really. And the Buddha was the first one who shaved the heads of the monks and the nuns. Usually they all had long dreads and long beards, or they were naked ascetics as well. So he goes to this park, and the leader, Potthapada, of this particular sangha sees him, and he says, "Okay, everybody, quiet. Here comes the Master Gautama. He likes things quiet, so shh." And then he comes and he says, "Master, it has been such a long time since you come, and I have a question for you, Venerable Sir." He says, when does consciousness? What is the end of consciousness? When does consciousness end? So he's asking basically, about death. When does consciousness end? And so the Buddha starts talking about when consciousness ends and what type of consciousness and how to find out about that. So this is another approach, rather than, it's less arcane, let me put it that way, than the supreme net. So I think we'll stop, okay? If you have any questions, should we take a few moments of questions? It's almost 9, so it's been pretty heavy intellectually. Yes, Jeff?
Just one thing real quick before I know how things go here, so I'm going to say this now because I know when questions start to come, I know people start to go. I just first want to say thank you for being here. Truly, you bring a level of understanding of the Dhamma that most Western people don't ever learn on their own nor encounter someone who has the ability to teach it. And I mean that in all honesty. It's just not something that is common. So I'm very grateful for you to bring the knowledge of the sutras
Thank
here
you.
To the Dharma Pump Temple. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And as we, as some questions come in and as we wrap up here, I just want to also thank everybody for being here. As you all know, the Dharma Bump Temple, we don't charge for anything we do. We do lots of prison outreach, homeless outreach, food distribution, always different classes going on. But there is a donation bowl down there, and Etan does come a long way to come down and teach. So any donations obviously are appreciated to support Etan and his ability to continue driving around and teaching. So again, thank you, Etan, and then
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.
So questions, maybe about 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, if I can, I will. Yeah, if you want to stay for a few minutes, I'm happy. Go ahead, Miss.
Just a question. If there's no soul, where is karma fit in your rebirth?
Okay, so the Buddha does never really talk about, he says there is rebirth, okay? So to take this question about the karma, but he says to talk about all of these things, in fact, is speculative. And this will not help you to get out of suffering. Knowing about rebirth, whether it's eternal, whether it's not eternal, whether the soul, this will not help you, in fact. What he says, and this is the closest to, your question hits it quite good, what is this self that is being, or what is this entity, not self, what is this thing that keeps being reborn? Okay? Now the only little hint that he gives, let me preface it before I give you the answer, okay? He says, monks, when you ask these types of questions, there's a monk who comes and says, I'm going to quit the order if you don't tell us, is the soul eternal, is the soul not eternal, is the soul both eternal and not eternal, is the soul neither eternal nor not eternal, and, does the Tathagata exist after death, does he not, does he both exist and not exist, does he neither exist or not exist? If you don't tell me these answers, I'm leaving the order. Okay? And the Buddha says, well, did I ever tell you that if you joined the order, I would tell you this? No, I never told you that. And if you stayed here for 1,000 years, I would never tell you that. Okay? So I'm here to tell you about suffering. I'm here to tell you about the cause of suffering, okay, the cessation and the path to the cessation of suffering. So it is, sir, as if a man were shot with an arrow, and he's laying on the ground and he's bleeding to death. And the villagers run up and they say, sir, please stay here. Don't move. We've called a physician and please stay here, sir. We'll go and get the physician now. And the man who's lying on the ground, bleeding, dying, will say, wait a minute, before you go, the man who shot the arrow, tell me, did he have a beard or did he not have a beard? The bow that he used, was it an iron bow or was it a wooden bow? That man would be asking speculative questions while he was dying. And in the same manner, monks, I will not be answering speculative questions because we're here to discuss suffering, which you are in now. So, but the only thing that he says, which is just a little bit, he says, your karmas are your progenitors, meaning your parents. Your karma are your belongings, and your karmas are your destination. So one could then, and this is what commentators have said, ergo, therefore, what we are is karmas. Now, how does that work? It's too subtle to use language and reason. How is it that these karmas are being reborn? In what form? Are they separate? Are they connected? What connects them? You see how many speculative questions we can get into even on that little... and even when he's talking about the different skandhas, well, how are they all connected? He says they're not connected. The perceptions are perceiving. Consciousness is conscious. The body is just functioning. The feelings are just feeling. There is no connection between. So it gets very subtle. And, this question how does this help us? I'm not picking on you. I'm just being the Buddha now, you know. How does this help us to discuss your suffering today? Whether you know what is born or being reborn or not being. Whether you now know this is what is being reborn. And that which is being reborn is eternal. Now in the Potthapada, he does give one example. Let me read this very quickly to you. And this is, do we have this? I'm sorry. Let me just borrow yours. In relationship to what you're asking, he does give a kind of another esoteric answer as to what is this that is being reborn, right? He says, this Potthapada comes with a friend of his to ask him this question, and so he's talking to the friend. He says, it's like this. His name is Kita. He says, Kita, it's like this. As if cow comes from a milk. From a cow comes milk. And from the milk come curds. And from the curds come butter. And from the butter comes ghee. And from the ghee comes junket, pudding. But when it is milk, it is not called curds, or butter, or ghee, or junket. And when it is curds, it is not called by any other names, and so on. So he's saying it's just like milk. Can you call the ghee milk? Can you call what you're frying in the ghee, or the pudding that you made from the milk, can you call it milk? And yet it has gone through numerous births and rebirths. So what is it, in fact, that is being born and reborn?
Dependent origination.
Well, yeah, it just becomes dependent origination, whatever that is being born and reborn. But that's the best I can give you is what he gives, and he doesn't give much. He says there is rebirth, hundreds and thousands. I know my own rebirths. But what is it that was reborn? I don't know if you know the Jataka tales. These were written 500 years after he died, and they're kind of whimsical. They're supposed to be, they're not really children's tales, but they're written in kind of a format where they discuss the previous lives of the Buddha. And in one life, for instance, he's a rabbit, and he's hopping around the forest, and he comes upon a hunter who's at his fire, and he's starving to death. This hunter has lost his way, and he's about to die. And so the future Buddha, who's now a bunny, throws himself into the fire so that the hunter will have something to eat and will survive. And so there are these types of stories of the Buddha. Now, can you say the Buddha was a rabbit? And incarnated from that to that and that. I don't know if you've listened to Osho, but he says the reason he doesn't eat meat is because he might be eating his future sister or his future brother, So, all right, one or two more questions? Or I know we've exhausted a lot, but...
I'm just wondering if you have somewhere written down your because you've gone through this, the dependent origination stuff.
Yes.
And you always, it's the first time I ever heard it, where you kind of go backwards.
You can go either way, and the Buddha goes back and forth.
I'm not that ultra familiar with
Yes.
it, but I found it, your explanation going backwards kind of really made a lot more sense to me.
You mean from death to ignorance?
Yeah.
You can go from ignorance to death.
Yeah, but I never thought about it the other way. Well, you have death, and then why
He
is
does
that?
it. It's in the Nidana. It's called the Nidana
You're saying,
Sutta.
the cause of this is that, whereas you say this causes that. So
Yeah.
going the other way.
Yeah, you
So I'm
can
just
go
wondering if
either
you
way.
ever wrote this down. your
He wrote it
explanation
down. It's in the Nidana
In
Sutta.
backwards?
Yeah, backwards and forwards.
In
Because
which sutta?
Ananda says, "Oh, this is so great. This sutta that you've explained to us, this discourse, and I get it." He says to the Buddha. "No, you don't." He says, and he recites it backwards and forwards to Ananda.
In which
But
sutta
it's
is
called the Nidana, Nidana, causation. I'll get it for you. Yeah, we'll be in touch. All right, guys. Thank you.